Hey Danny, hope you're doing well, man. Um, I can't remember if I think if I remember right, you have returned to somewhere in Central America. So hope you're doing well. I know for a while there you were getting situated and trying to figure out the internet and all that kind of stuff. But by now maybe you're settled in. Anyway, I want to send you a video reply on the work in week 8 here. I've asked you guys like some super hard questions, and I appreciate your diligence in trying to address them. Agamben is super hard. I think he forces us to ask kind of those fundamental questions that can produce some fresh insight on the faith, law, the relationship between these, that kind of stuff. And I think that you are following him quite well. Um, And I think that the key is that for Agamben's account, um, wherever there's a kind of constitutional relationship, a covenant binding parties together, whatever becomes the code, the legal rules that govern that relationship, there's always something deeper that brought that relationship into being to begin with. That was the basis for the prescription of the rules, the law. And that deeper bond is, as Agamben presents it, the bond of faith. So we talked about that in earlier sections of the letter, but I think that's a way of helpfully showing what Paul's argument might be doing in saying that the problem with some of his relatives is that they pursue the righteousness of the law as if it were a matter of works, as if it were a matter of um, sort of meeting the conditions that were theirs in the code, as opposed to pursuing it according to faith, which makes the righteousness that God gives a matter of promise and gift and not something that is subject to compliance with the code. Doesn't mean the code is irrelevant. It means that the law is a witness to an underlying pact or bond, and the purpose of the law is to fulfill that bond. It's not to sort of make sure that its conditions are met. So that's what I think Agamben is about. And I think you got some good stuff on that. You could probably tell if you read my chapter or listen to the podcast that I sort of part ways with just about everybody on this difficult line in Romans 9:6 about all who are of Israel not being themselves Israel. The mainstream interpretation of that has been to say that, there's a bunch of people that are nominally Israel or something like that. Israel according to descent, but then only part of that is the true Israel, and that's the Israel by faith. I don't think that's right. And so I've laid out my reasons for that. The ones I'd maybe summarize here are that I just don't see how that would fit Paul's argument in Romans 9 to 11. How would it serve his concern for these relatives that he's grieving over, that he then urges the audience not to be boasting against and says at the end are beloved of God according to election because of the ancestors? How would it serve that argument for him to say effectively they don't really count as Israel because they don't have faith? I just don't think that would fit what he's saying. So my take is that um, Paul's relatives are like Isaac and Jacob. They are not only of Israel, but are themselves Israel. They have survived across the dramatic history of Israel's life, whereby Ishmael weaves off in one way, the Edomites, Esau weaves off in another way. Many of the 10 tribes are assimilated by Gentile peoples, and yet Israel persists. God continues to shape it into being, and his relatives are among those people who are not only of Israel, but are themselves Israel, the fruit of God's election, and therefore people whom the audience is called to embrace as family, even in their hostility. So that's what I think fits better. the argument. And I think that means that belonging to Israel is not a matter of people having sufficient faith or something, but instead a matter of God's election, which, according to Paul, will over generations produce faith. And so he's not giving up on these relatives of his. And he even then, you know, offers an account about how they're actually not faithful because of a dulling that God has allowed to come over them. And that this is the very means whereby the audience from among the Gentiles have found themselves grafted into the family. And the purpose of their being grafted in, Paul says, is actually to make these relatives of his jealous, so that they will come to faith in the Messiah and enjoy their own inheritance. That's how I take the argument to unfold. Raises all kinds of other questions, I know, but I think the key is to try to make it fit what Paul's saying in Romans 9 to 11. And so when you get to the question I asked you here in the second forum about the significance of Romans 10:9, I think you're right to say Paul's not saying, here's the system that everybody has to comply with. You have to meet the condition of faith by confessing that Jesus is Lord and believing in your heart that God raised him from the dead in order to be saved. I don't think that's the point. I think the point is, building on how he's drawing this from Deuteronomy, that finding the words Lord Jesus on your lips and the conviction in your heart that God raised him from the dead is something that God has brought near, something that God has done. And so he's telling the audience, you are witnesses to salvation as a gift, not as a reward that you receive because you met the condition of faith. And because of that, you're witnesses as you're being saved to the mercy that still is flowing into the lives of these relatives of mine for whom I'm grieving so much, and therefore are called to be that witness and to continue to extend them welcome even as they are being enemies to you. And this, of course, is in line with what he says, I think, so unequivocally in verses 4 and 5 of chapter 9, which is that his relatives are Israelites. Theirs are the covenants, the promises, the ancestors, the service, the Messiah himself. And so it doesn't seem to me like at any point we should understand Paul to effectively cancel what he says he's grieving so much over. So that's my take. Hope that's helpful to you, and appreciate your diligent work.